In this clip, I'll run you through some fundamentals so you'll know how to pair up and configure just about any Akai Rack Sampler with just about any MPC. But first, I'll run through the concepts and relationships between programs, keygroups, and multis for those that are struggling with the Akai Sampler universe. For best viewing, I recommend watching the clip on a laptop or larger display, such as a TV, etc. Put the clip in full screen mode and set the resolution to 1080p via the settings widget down on the bottom right. If you enjoy the clip, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, feel free to share, and if you're after sample packs, then check out store.tonelab.au, where you'll find sample packs ready to play in your sampler's native format. Last of all, those needing drum machine tuition or other studio services, one-on-one remote sessions are available. Check the description below for details. With that aside, let's dive into the concepts of what Akai refers to as a multi, a program, and a key group. And this should provide an all-round general idea of what you're looking at, regardless of whether or not you're using an MPC or some other type of Akai Rack Sampler. The multi first appeared with the introduction of the S3000XL. Prior to this, in most cases, you would configure a program to listen on a specific MIDI channel and make sure your MIDI receive channel is set to Omni. That is, if you wanted some sort of multi-timbral capability. And that doesn't apply to all models. So if you didn't have that particular feature in your Akai sampler, then you would look to a single program to do the heavy lifting. And in most cases, there'd be a specific number of key groups that you could add samples to. And with that, you'd be able to trigger multiple samples simultaneously from a sequencer or some other MIDI device. So then, what is a key group? Well, within each key group, you would allocate a sample that resides in the Akai's memory. Then you'd configure the various parameters to manipulate that sample in various ways. For example, if you had an S900 would allow up to 32 key groups to be added to each program, and then up to 32 different programs could potentially be held in memory. You would then select a single program so that you could play it from a MIDI sequencer or some other type of MIDI device. So, in a nutshell, you can think of an Akai program much like a container that holds key groups, and you could think of key groups like seats in a cinema with allocated seating, where you allocate your samples to key groups much like people to seats in a cinema. But unlike cinema seats, key groups don't physically hold samples. They merely reference or point to samples that are in your sampler's memory. And because of that, key groups and other programs can also reference any sample in memory too. So potentially, you could have several programs that manipulate the same set of samples, but in different ways. Hopefully that helps you understand the relationship between samples, key groups, and programs, and why there is the ability to save or load Akai programs with or without samples. I might just add, there's a full comprehensive tutorial here on the channel for the S900, which is mostly the same for the S950 as well. I'll leave the link in the description below. Speaking of the S950, the 950 can offer up to 64 key groups, essentially doubling the number of key groups that could be added to a program inside the 900. Alternatively, if you stepped up to the S1000, and this was quite revolutionary because that offered up to 99 key groups, plus the ability to layer 4 samples per key group. Fast forward to 1996, when Akai introduced the S3000XL, not only could it hold up to 128 programs, each program could contain up to 99 key groups with the ability to layer 4 samples per key group. But it also debuted multi-mode, whereas multi-mode allowed 16 programs to be played simultaneously from a MIDI keyboard or MIDI sequencer. So obviously, there's been quite an evolution between the S900 and the S3000XL. But the Apple didn't fall far from the tree, so to speak. And with each model, these advances made it fairly painless for Akai owners to upgrade without losing their sound libraries, albeit programs and samples. But if you own one of these, then you know that there's no sequencer on board. Some have MIDI file playback, which is cute, but ultimately you need a sequencer to record and edit tracks, and one that's comprehensive enough to make use of the features in one of these rack samplers. And it just so happens that literally any MPC will make a very dependable candidate for just about any rack sampler on the market. So in terms of the Akai sampler universe, these concepts we've covered are more or less mirrored across both Akai Rack Samplers and those MPCs that possess keygroups, like the MPC 4000, among others. In terms of those MPCs that came before the 4000, it was pretty much a simple case of you would allocate samples directly into drum programs, not to be confused with regular programs found in the rack samplers. And so, in terms of the rack samplers, the basic rule of thumb applies. Samples go into keygroups. Keygroups go into programs. And then programs can be played individually on their own, but they can also be added into a multi. That is, if you have an Akai sampler with the multi feature. On the other hand, if you're using an older Akai sampler without multi-mode, like the 900 here, then it's a fairly simple affair. Your sequencer, MPC or otherwise, will need to have at least one MIDI track configured that uses the same MIDI channel as your Akai Rack Sampler. When you tap your MPC pads or MIDI keyboard tethered to your MPC, then you'll be transmitting MIDI data through to your Rack Sampler. Alternatively, if we jump over to the S3000XL, you'll notice the top leftmost buttons labelled Single and Multi. Single mode is more or less a hangover of the early Akai samplers before it. However, on the 3000XL, and I'm sure a few others, single mode could allow you to select more than one program for layering purposes, etc. But also, if those MIDI channels belonging to those programs are set accordingly, and provided that the basic MIDI control page has its single program select channel set to Omni, then single mode can offer a similar experience to multi-mode. You'll just have to configure each program to its own unique MIDI channel. However, in multi-mode, you do have a few extra levels of control over your programs, such as tuning, keyboard range, and priority. And by default, each part of the multi has its own MIDI channel predefined sequentially. So to demonstrate this, I'll add some ToneLab kits into the first 6 multi-parts. Or I could potentially even add the same program to 2 parts if I wanted to, and then set the MIDI channels for those 2 parts to the same MIDI channel. That is, if I wanted some drums or a bass patch, etc., to sound thicker. Ultimately, you can think of the multi-mode as a multi-track mode. However, it was really intended by Akai to be a dedicated multi-timbral mode, which allows for an easy way to create keyboard splits with your existing programs. Unlike single mode, you can transpose parts up or down, fine-tune parts, which is handy if you're wanting to layer a synth pad to thicken it up or whatever. You've got key ranges that you can set across your key bed, which makes it easy to create splits, etc., as well as voice priority assignments, which comes in handy if you find that you're exceeding the available polyphony and samples are being noticeably cut off. If that's the case, then you can set a hierarchy for parts, albeit programs within those parts, that can be given priority over others, so you can avoid lead samples being choked out unnecessarily. Further to that, you've got control over the typical features you'd find in single mode too, such as stereo output level control, dedicated pan control, individual output level control, effects buses, and send levels. But another benefit that multi has over single mode is once you've configured your 16 parts, you can then save the multi and load it up later, by itself or with programs and samples. And so once you've got your multi loaded with a few programs, you can then tether your sequencer, like an MPC 2000, 60, 3000, 4000, or maybe even an X via MIDI cable. MIDI out of your sequencer to the MIDI in on the rear of your rack sampler. Then set up a track in your sequence as a MIDI track. I'll set the 2000 XL to use a MIDI track and configure it to transmit MIDI over channel 1 via rear MIDI port B. Then, by dialing the correct number and port here, I can then add device names that pertain to each channel and port, like so. Then, in regard to the next track, I can send out over channel 2, port B, and you'll notice the device names appear as I scroll through accordingly. And I'd personally do this until I have 16 tracks in my MPC that correlate with the 16 parts of the 3000 XL's multi. Then save this as a sequence that I could store in my AutoLoad configuration so that my 2000 XL boots up with this each time I power it on. If you're not sure how to do that, see my quick tip tutorial on how to configure AutoLoad on the MPC 2000 XL. I'll leave the link in the description. On the other hand, if you had an MPC 3000 or a 60, both of which have very similar operating systems, then again, pull up a track, set the track type to MIDI, then configure the channel and output port per however many tracks you need. And then similarly, with the 3000, I can add device names. But the cool thing about the 3000 is it'll remember the device names even after I turn it off. There's no need to save it. If you have an early Akai Rack Sampler that predates multi-mode, like the S900 here, then one MIDI channel will suffice. And you can leave your rack sampler's MIDI receive mode option as Omni, but don't forget you can have more than one track configured to use the same MIDI channel. This way you can mute and unmute individual key groups that relate to different samples. Now if you've configured your tracks, you should be able to tap pads across different MPC tracks that will trigger different programs inside your rack sampler's multi. And apologies in advance for the basic beat, but now if I hit play and unmute the tracks I recorded earlier, you'll hear sounds from different programs in the multi, all playing across different MIDI channels simultaneously. And if I quickly jump back to single mode, you'll hear them all sounding out at the same time, just like they should if you wanted them layered. Anyway, that's all for this clip. I hope that's helped. Don't forget to like and subscribe, check out the Instagram profile, and have a listen to the ToneLab sample packs. There's previews of all the packs on there. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.